The pen felt heavy in my hand as I stared at the launch readiness form. The system was poisoned and would crash in 2 days. I knew it, and Julian knew it, but he still pushed the document across the desk. If I didn't sign right now, I'd be fired tonight, and Jasper's surgery would go unpaid. Before we continue and find out how it all began, please subscribe and leave a like. We truly love to read your comments below. The cursor blinked on the dark monitor in the corner of the office, a rhythmic pulse that matched the headache tightening behind my eyes. I had spent the last 14 hours rewriting the core logic for the Sentinel engine, the predictive modeling software that had put Thorne Analytics on the cover of Forbes 3 times in the last 2 years. The glass walls of the server room reflected my tired face, pale and drawn, a sharp contrast to the sleek, polished perfection of the corporate headquarters around me. Julian Thorne, the man whose name was on the building and whose face was on every magazine, was currently upstairs in the executive suite, likely practicing his acceptance speech for the Tech Innovator of the Year award. He didn't know the code was broken. He didn't know that the demo scheduled for tomorrow would crash if I didn't manually patch the memory leak he had insisted on ignoring during the last sprint. I saved the final execute command, watched the compiler run green, and finally allowed myself to exhale. My phone vibrated against the metal desk, lighting up with a notification from the veterinary clinic. The message from Dr. Eris was short, professional, and devastating enough to make my hands shake as I packed my laptop. Jasper's scans were back. The mass on his spleen hadn't shrunk, it had grown. Surgery was no longer an option we could discuss over coffee in a few months. It was a necessity for this week, maybe even tomorrow, if I wanted my 14-year-old golden retriever to see another winter. The estimate attached to the email was formatted as a PDF, but the preview showed a number that exceeded the balance of my savings account by exactly $4,000. I stared at the screen, the silence of the empty office pressing in on me. I was the lead architect of a multimillion-dollar system, the ghost in the machine that made Julian Thorne look like a genius, and I couldn't afford to save the only living thing that loved me unconditionally. I grabbed my bag, the leather strap digging into my shoulder, and headed for the elevator. I wasn't going home. I was going to the 42nd floor. Julian's office was a temple to minimalism, all white marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the Seattle skyline into a backdrop for his ego. He was sitting behind his desk, a vast expanse of reclaimed timber, reviewing a physical stack of documents with a fountain pen in his hand. He didn't look up when I entered, a power move he had perfected years ago. I stood in the doorway, waiting, listening to the scratch of the nib against paper, and the low hum of the climate control system. Finally, he capped the pen, set it down with precise alignment, and looked at me with that practiced warmth that fooled investors and journalists alike. He smiled, gesturing to the uncomfortable designer chair opposite him. He asked if the patch was ready for the demo. I told him it was done. I told him the system was stable. Then, before he could dismiss me with a nod, I told him I needed to talk about my compensation. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room shifted, becoming thinner and colder. Julian leaned back, lacing his fingers together, and asked me to clarify. I kept my voice steady, despite the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I explained the situation with Jasper. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I simply stated the facts. I had been working at 60% of the market rate for 5 years. I had built Sentinel from scratch. I needed an advance on my bonus, or a salary adjustment effective immediately, to cover the surgery. Julian listened in silence, his eyes tracking a raindrop sliding down the window pane behind me. When I finished, he sighed, a sound of disappointed paternalism that made my skin crawl. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, bound document, sliding it across the timber surface until it rested under my hand. He told me that he had anticipated this conversation. He said he knew I was under financial strain, and it pained him to see his partner in spirit struggling with personal matters. The document was a new employment agreement. He called it a restructuring of my role, a formalization of my importance to the company. My heart lifted for a fraction of a second. I reached for the pages, flipping past the dense legal jargon to the compensation section. The number was higher. Not fair market value, but enough. Enough to pay Dr. Eris. Enough to fix Jasper. I looked up at him, relief washing over me, ready to thank him. That was when Julian pointed a manicured finger at the paragraph below the salary figure. He told me to read the intellectual property clause. I read it. Then I read it again, my blood running cold. The clause was a total surrender. It stated that not only did Thorn Analytics own everything I had created in the past, but it also laid claim to any future work. They owned any code, concept, or algorithm I produced for the next 10 years, regardless of my employment status. It included a non-compete agreement that effectively banned me from working in the tech sector anywhere in North America, Europe, or Asia for 5 years after termination. It was a career death sentence. It was an ownership deed, not for my work, but for my mind. I looked at Julian, my voice barely a whisper. I told him I couldn't sign this. I told him it was illegal, unenforceable. He smiled, a slow predatory curving of his lips, and picked up his phone. He didn't call a lawyer. He opened a photo gallery and turned the screen toward me. The image was grainy, taken from a security camera, but the subject was clear. It was me 3 years ago, exhausted and desperate, copying a library of open source code onto a private server to meet a deadline Julian had set. It was a technical violation of our compliance protocol, a fireable offense, something we had laughed about over drinks when the project launched successfully. But now, in the cold light of his office, it looked like corporate espionage. Julian spoke softly. He said that if I didn't sign the contract, he would be forced to terminate me for cause. He would be forced to report the security breach to the authorities and our clients. He would ensure that I was blacklisted so thoroughly that I wouldn't be able to get a job fixing printers at a library, let alone writing code. And then he mentioned Jasper. He asked if the old dog could survive the stress of his owner losing her apartment. The trap clamped shut around my ankle with a metallic finality. I looked at the man I had trusted, the man I had viewed as a mentor, and saw him for the first time. There was no partnership. There was no friendship. I was a resource to be mined until I was empty. The silence in the room was deafening. I thought about walking out. I thought about throwing the heavy glass paperweight through the window. But then I thought about Jasper's labored breathing, and the way he rested his head on my knee when I cried. I picked up the pen. My hand felt heavy, like it belonged to someone else. I signed my name on the last page. The ink looked black and permanent, a stain on the white paper. Julian took the document back immediately, sliding it into a folder, as if it were just another invoice. Before I could stand, the heavy oak door opened. A young man walked in, radiating the unearned confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car, and his smile was too wide, too bright. Julian stood up, his demeanor shifting instantly back to the charismatic leader. He introduced the stranger as Carter. He told me that Carter was a visionary strategist, joining the team to help streamline the Sentinel development process. I looked at Carter. He looked at me with the vague disinterest of a tourist looking at the help. Julian placed a hand on Carter's shoulder and delivered the final blow. He told me that my new primary responsibility, under the contract I had just signed, was to onboard Carter. I was to teach him everything I knew about the Sentinel architecture. I was to give him the keys to the kingdom I had built. I walked out of the office 10 minutes later, leaving them laughing about a golf trip to Pebble Beach. The elevator ride down was a blur of silver doors and floor numbers counting down to 0. I made it to the lobby without screaming, walked past the security guard who nodded at me, and stepped out into the Seattle drizzle. My car was parked in the furthest corner of the garage, an old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. I got in and locked the doors. The smell of wet dog hair and old coffee filled the small space, a scent that usually comforted me, but now smelled like failure. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had saved my dog, but I had sold my life. I had handed Julian the weapon he would eventually use to execute me. I drove to the veterinary clinic in a daze. The wipers slapped against the windshield, a metronome keeping time with my racing heart. When I walked into the waiting room, Dr. Eris smiled at me, unaware that the credit card I was about to hand her was shackled to a corpse. I sat on the floor with Jasper while they prepped him for the intake, burying my face in his golden fur. He licked my hand, his tail thumping weakly against the linoleum. He trusted me to fix this. He trusted me to take care of him. I whispered a promise into his soft ear. I promised him he would be okay. And then, in a voice so low even I could barely hear it, I made a promise to Julian Thorne. He wanted my work. He wanted my mind. He wanted to own me. I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would give him so much of me that he would choke on it. The next morning, I arrived at the office 20 minutes early. My badge worked. The coffee machine hummed. The server room was cold and loud. Everything looked the same, but the world had tilted on its axis. I sat at my desk and opened the terminal. Usually, I started my day by optimizing the background processes, cleaning up the messy code Carter or the other junior devs might have left. Today I didn't. I opened the new project folder Julian had assigned, Knowledge Transfer Carter. I started typing. I didn't write a virus. I didn't delete files. I began to write documentation. Massive, dense, technically accurate, and completely impenetrable documentation. I would follow the contract to the letter. I would be the perfect employee. I would teach Carter everything just as I was told. And I would watch them fail because understanding the syntax of a language is not the same as speaking it. Carter arrived at 10, carrying a latte and looking bored. He pulled a chair up to my desk, invading my personal space with the scent of expensive cologne. He asked me to walk him through the basics of the predictive algorithm. He said he wanted to get his hands dirty before the client meeting next week. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the way his eyes glazed over when I used technical terms. I saw the way he checked his phone every 30 seconds. He was a holosuit, a placeholder, a weapon Julian intended to replace me with once the transfer was complete. I smiled at him, a thin, tight expression that didn't reach my eyes. Let's start with the data ingestion protocols, I said. It's the foundation of everything. I opened a file containing 40,000 lines of raw code. Read this. Let me know when you have questions. The days turned into a week. Jasper came home, stitched up and groggy but alive. I slept on the floor next to his bed, waking up every few hours to check his breathing. In the office, the atmosphere was suffocating. Julian stopped by my desk daily, placing a hand on the back of my chair, asking if Carter was getting up to speed. He watched us like a hawk, looking for any sign of resistance, any hint that I was holding back. I gave him none. I forwarded him every email I sent to Carter. I copied him on every training document. I drowned him in compliance. I was becoming invisible, a fixture of the office furniture, just another piece of equipment he owned. But beneath the surface I was observing. I was learning the rhythm of their incompetence. I noticed that Carter didn't actually read the code. He just ran the executables and looked at the output. If it looked green, he assumed it was good. I noticed that Julian was too busy courting a new investor from Tokyo to audit the technical reports Carter was submitting. They were getting sloppy. They were getting arrogant. They assumed that because I was compliant, the system was safe. They forgot that the system wasn't a static object. It was a living thing breathing data, and it needed a master to keep it tame. I wasn't taming it anymore. I was just feeding it. And sooner or later, it was going to get hungry. On Friday afternoon, the first crack appeared. A warning light blinked on the dashboard of the staging server. It was a minor latency issue in the verified user loop. Normally, I would have fixed it in 30 seconds. It was a known quirk of the database architecture. I watched the red light pulse. Carter was sitting 3 feet away, watching a video on his phone. Julian was in his glass office, laughing into a headset. I looked at the contract clause I had memorized. Duties include instruction of designated personnel. My duty was to instruct, not to intervene. I turned to Carter. The staging server is showing a latency spike, I said neutrally. What do you think we should do? Carter glanced at the screen, annoyed at the interruption. He waved a hand dismissively. It's probably just a glitch. Reboot the instance. A reboot was the wrong answer. A reboot would clear the cache but leave the memory leak active, causing a compound failure within 6 hours. It was a rookie mistake. It was dangerous. Are you sure? I asked, my voice devoid of inflection. A reboot will reset the session logs. Carter rolled his eyes. Just do it, Renee. I'm the strategist here. We need a clean slate for the Monday stress test. I nodded slowly. Understood. I typed the command. I didn't press enter immediately. I looked at the blinking cursor. This was it. This was the first step off the ledge. I pressed enter. The screen went black as the server cycled. Carter went back to his phone. Upstairs, Julian continued his conversation, unaware that the foundation of his company had just developed a hairline fracture. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't guilt. It was a cold, quiet vibration of power. They thought they had trapped me. They thought the contract was a cage. They didn't realize that by forcing me to follow their orders, they had absolved me of the consequences. I was no longer the architect. I was the executioner, and I had just sharpened the blade. That evening, I left the office exactly at 5 o'clock. I didn't stay late to check the logs. I didn't monitor the reboot cycle. I walked out into the cool evening air, feeling lighter than I had in years. I drove home, listening to the hum of the tires on the pavement. When I got inside, Jasper greeted me with a slow tail wag, his cone bumping against the doorframe. I knelt down and hugged him, burying my face in his neck. "It started, buddy," I whispered. He licked my cheek. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in the dark server room of Thorn Analytics, a line of code was slowly consuming the available memory, byte by byte. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't sabotage. It was just the inevitable result of bad management. And I was going to let it burn. The Monday morning stress test was a slow-motion car crash that only I could see. The memory leak from Friday's reboot had not magically resolved itself. Instead, it had metastasized, eating up 30% of the available RAM before the coffee pot was even empty. I sat at my station, watching the resource monitor climb into the yellow zone while Carter leaned against my desk, scrolling through his Instagram feed. He hadn't noticed the lag yet because he wasn't looking at the back-end logs. He was waiting for the user interface to load, tapping his foot with an impatient rhythm that grated on my nerves. When the dashboard finally popped up, delayed by a full 2 seconds, he didn't see a warning sign. He saw a success. "We're live," he announced, loud enough for the entire OpenPlan office to hear. "Smooth rollout, everyone." I opened my mouth to correct him, to explain that a 2-second delay on a local staging server would translate to a 10-second hang for a client in Tokyo, but I stopped. The contract burned in my memory like a brand. Instruction of designated personnel. I had instructed him on how to monitor the logs last week. If he chose not to look at them, that was an operational decision, not a training failure. I logged the latency in the daily report, timestamped it, and saved it to the secure folder on the company drive. Then I emailed the report to Carter with the subject line Monday Performance Metrics, copying Julian. It was the digital equivalent of shouting into a void, but it created a paper trail that would survive the coming apocalypse. By Wednesday, the cracks were becoming visible to the naked eye. The Apex Logistics account, our largest and most demanding client, submitted a ticket regarding data synchronization delays. Julian stormed out of his glass office, waving a printout of the email like a weapon, and marched straight to my desk. He ignored Carter, who was frantically typing on his phone, and zeroed in on me. "Renee, why is Apex experiencing lag?" he demanded, his voice tight with controlled aggression. "We promised them real-time analytics. This is unacceptable." I looked up at him, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "The system is prioritizing memory allocation due to a localized bottleneck," I said, using the precise technical terminology that I knew would frustrate him. "It's a side effect of the current configuration." Julian's eyes narrowed. "Fix it," he snapped. "I don't care about configurations. I care about speed. Apex is threatening to withhold their quarterly payment." Before I could answer, Carter jumped in, eager to save face. "It's the safety protocols, Julian," he said, improvising wildly. "The checksum verification is running double passes. It's dragging down the throughput. If we streamline the verification process, we can boost speed by 40%. I froze. Disabling the checksum verification on a predictive modeling engine was like removing the brakes from a Formula One car to make it go faster. It would undeniably increase speed, but the first time the system hit a curve, corrupted data, a packet loss, a sync error, it would crash spectacularly. "Is that true, Renee?" Julian asked, turning back to me. Can we speed it up by adjusting these checksums? I looked at Carter, who was beaming with the pride of an idiot who thinks he just invented fire. Then I looked at Julian. Disabling the verification would increase processing speed immediately. I confirmed, careful not to lie. However, it removes the safeguards against data corruption. If a bad packet enters the system, it will be processed as truth. Julian waved his hand dismissively. Our data streams are clean. We pay a premium for that. Implement Carter's solution. I hesitated. This wasn't just bad code. This was malpractice. Julian, I strongly advise against this. The risk of database poisoning is... He cut me off, leaning down until his face was inches from mine. I didn't ask for advice, Renee. I asked for a solution. You signed an agreement to support the strategic direction of this company. Carter is setting the strategy. You are the mechanic. Do not make me question your commitment again. The threat was clear. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about the non-compete, the lawsuit he would file, the destruction of my ability to provide for Jasper. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I'll need a written authorization to bypass the security protocols, I said quietly. It's a core system change. Julian sneered, pulling out his phone. He sent an email 3 seconds later. Authorize immediate optimization of verification protocols per Carter's recommendation. Priority speed. I stared at the message. He had just signed his own death warrant, and he was arrogant enough to think it was a victory. Get it done by noon, he said, straightening his tie. I have a lunch meeting with Apex. He walked away, leaving me alone with the digital bomb he had just ordered me to build. Carter leaned in, whispering conspiratorially. See? Sometimes you just have to think outside the box, Renee. You get too hung up on the rules. I spent the next 2 hours writing the bypass. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, dismantling the safety nets I had spent 3 years weaving. I commented out the integrity checks. I disabled the redundancy loops. I widened the data pipes until the system was a gaping maw, ready to swallow anything fed into it without question. It felt like tearing down a house I had built with my own hands, brick by brick. When I finally compiled the new build, the processing speed jumped off the charts. The latency vanished. The system was flying. It was also completely blind. When I deployed the update, the silence in the office was broken by Carter's cheer. Boom! Look at those numbers. He pointed at the dashboard, where the green throughput graph was spiking vertically. That's what I'm talking about. I felt a hollow sickness in my stomach. The speed was real, but it was artificial. We were now processing data faster than we could verify it. Somewhere in the millions of transactions flowing through the Apex servers, a single error would occur. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But statistics were inevitable. And without the checksums, that error wouldn't be caught. It would be processed, stored, and replicated. The Sentinel engine would start predicting futures based on hallucinations. That evening, I drove to the pharmacy to pick up Jasper's new medication. The bill was $300. I paid it with the company credit card Julian had allowed me to keep for incidental expenses, knowing he would scrutinize the expense report later. When I got home, Jasper was waiting by the door, his tail thumping a slow rhythm against the floorboards. He was moving better today, the pain medication doing its work. I sat on the rug beside him, feeding him the pills wrapped in cheese. I made a bad thing today, Jasper. I whispered into his fur. I broke it on purpose. He nudged my hand, asking for more cheese. He didn't care about data integrity. He just wanted to be fed. In that moment, I understood Julian's motivation perfectly. He didn't care how the sausage was made, as long as he got to eat. Friday arrived with a false sense of security. The Apex dashboard was all green. The client was happy. Julian was ecstatic. He called an all-hands meeting in the main conference room to celebrate the record-breaking performance. I stood in the back, leaning against the wall, while Julian toasted Carter's fresh perspective. He didn't mention my name. He didn't mention the 14 hours of coding I had done to enable Carter's reckless idea. I was a ghost in the room, necessary but unseen. Carter stood at the front, soaking up the applause, making jokes about trimming the fat from the old code. I watched them, feeling a cold detachment settle over me. They were celebrating a gas leak because it smelled sweet. The first tremor hit at 4:00 p.m. I was at my desk organizing my personal files on a flash drive. Photos of Jasper, old tax returns, nothing proprietary, when a notification popped up on my secondary monitor. It was a low-priority alert from the data warehousing unit. Duplicate key exception. It meant the database had tried to save two identical records and failed. Usually, the checksum would have caught the duplication before it hit the database. Now, without the filter, the system was just shoving data in until it choked. I cleared the alert. I didn't fix the cause. I wasn't asked to fix the cause. I was asked to optimize for speed. 10 minutes later, another alert. Then 3 more. The error log, which usually scrolled slowly, began to tick upward like a stopwatch. Data type mismatch.
Nul pointé exception.
Reference error. The corruption was starting. It was small, microscopic, even deep in the archival tables where no one looked. But it was spreading. I watched the log fill up with red text, entranced by the rhythm of the destruction. Carter walked by, sipping a Red Bull. Still running smooth, he said, glancing at the green dashboard on the main wall. The dashboard only showed speed, not accuracy. Yes, I said. It's running very fast. Julian called me into his office at 4:45 p.m. He looked flushed, happy. Renee, I want you to prepare the final stability report for the weekend, he said. I need a signature guaranteeing that the current build is stable for the global rollout on Monday. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a formal declaration of technical readiness. If I signed it, I was personally vouching for a system I knew was compromised. If I didn't sign it, I was admitting that I hadn't done my job supporting the strategy, triggering the termination clause. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at the window where the rain was picking up again. If I signed and the system crashed, I could be blamed for incompetence. But if I didn't sign, I would be fired for insubordination tonight. I needed one more paycheck. Just one more to clear the vet bills completely. Picked up the pen. The system is performing exactly as designed under the current parameters, I said carefully. Julian nodded, not listening to the caveat. Just sign it, Renee. I signed. I wasn't lying. The system was performing exactly as designed. It was designed to fail. I left the office with the signed document sitting in Julian's outbox. The elevator ride down felt different this time. The building felt heavy, groaning under the weight of the corrupted data spinning on the servers upstairs. I got into my car and sat there for a long time, listening to the rain. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Carter. Hey, seeing some weird numbers on the Asia node. Probably just a glitch. Have a good weekend. I turned off the phone. It wasn't a glitch. It was the beginning of the end, and I had the entire weekend to watch it burn from a distance. The phone on my nightstand began to scream at 3:14 a.m. It wasn't the polite vibration of a text message or the soft chime of an email. It was the harsh, jarring ringtone I had assigned to the emergency escalation line, a sound I hadn't heard in 2 years. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, displacing the heavy warmth of Jasper's head on my legs. He let out a low, confused grumble but didn't lift his head. The room was dark, illuminated only by the strobe light flashing of the screen. I knew before I answered what had happened. The Asia markets had opened. The Monday morning rollout had hit the Tokyo servers. And the Sentinel engine, stripped of its safety gear, had crashed into a wall at 1,000 miles an hour. I answered the call in the dark. Carter's voice was unrecognizable, a high-pitched frantic noise that sounded like a child lost in a supermarket. He wasn't using corporate buzzwords anymore. He was shouting about phantom inventory and cascading failures. He said the Apex logistics hub in Singapore had ground to a halt because the system was routing trucks to warehouses that didn't exist. I listened to him hyperventilate for 10 seconds. Then I cut him off. I'm coming in, I said. My voice sounded calm, detached, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well. I hung up and looked at Jasper. He was sleeping again, his breathing rhythmic and heavy. I didn't want to leave him. I had a terrible feeling that if I walked out that door, the world I came back to would be unrecognizable. The drive to the office was a blur of wet asphalt and red traffic lights that I ignored. The city was asleep, but the 42nd floor of the Thorn Tower was blazing with light, a lighthouse of panic in the gray skyline. When I stepped out of the elevator, the silence of the lobby was gone. The air smelled of stale coffee and fear. Junior developers were huddled in corners, staring at tablets. The operations manager was yelling into a headset, his face a mask of red fury. I walked past them, my heels clicking on the polished concrete, heading straight for the war room. Julian was standing at the head of the conference table, his sleeves rolled up, his tie gone. He looked like a captain on the bridge of a sinking ship, looking for someone to throw overboard. Carter was slumped in a chair, pale and sweating, staring at a projection on the main wall. The screen was a sea of red error logs. The beautiful green dashboard from Friday was gone, replaced by a live feed of the disaster. Database corruption index, 48%. The screen read, restoration failed. Julian turned when I entered. His eyes were wild. Fix it, he snarled. Just fix it, Renee. Restore the Friday backup. I walked to the terminal, the eyes of the entire executive team burning into my back. I sat down and pulled up the backup logs. My fingers hovered over the keys. I knew what I was going to find, but seeing it in white text on a black background made my stomach drop. We can't restore from Friday, I said, my voice cutting through the room. The synchronization protocols were optimized for speed. They bypassed the integrity check. I turned to look at Julian. The corruption synced to the backup server in real time. The Friday backup is poisoned. The Saturday backup is poisoned. There is no clean version of the database. The silence that followed was absolute. Carter made a small choking sound. Julian stopped pacing. He walked over to me, moving slowly like a predator stalking wounded prey. What do you mean? He asked, his voice dangerously soft. You said the optimization was safe. You signed the stability report. I stood up, meeting his gaze. I said the system would perform as designed. You designed it to bypass verification. You authorized the removal of the checksums. Julian laughed, a harsh, barking sound that had no humor in it. He turned to the room, spreading his arms wide. Did everyone hear that? He pointed a trembling finger at me. She admits it. She deliberately dismantled the security protocols. He looked back at me, his face twisting into a mask of betrayal. I authorized an optimization, Renee. I authorized you to make the system efficient. I did not authorize you to destroy the fundamental safety architecture of my company. That is gross negligence. That is sabotage. The trap snapped shut. I saw it now, clear as day. Julian hadn't just been arrogant. He had been insulating himself. His email had been vague. Optimize immediately. He hadn't written disable the checksums. I had made that technical decision. I had executed the command. And I had signed the paper saying it was stable. He had goaded me into digging my own grave. And now he was pushing me into it to save himself from the wrath of Apex Logistics. You knew, I whispered. You knew exactly what optimization meant. I am a CEO, not a coder, Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. I rely on my chief architect to protect the system. You failed. You failed because you were jealous of Carter. You failed because you wanted to prove a point. He grabbed a folder from the table and slammed it down. Security, he roared. 2 uniformed guards stepped into the room. They didn't look like the friendly guys I chatted with in the morning. They looked like enforcers. Escort her out, Julian commanded. Revoke her access immediately. And get legal on the phone. I want a suit filed for damages by morning. You can't do this, I said, my voice shaking for the first time. I need my severance. I need the insurance. Jasper. Julian cut me off with a sneer. You should have thought about your dog before you tanked $100 million contract. You're fired for cause, Renee. That means 0 severance. 0 insurance. And when I'm done with you in court, you'll be lucky if you can afford a goldfish. Carter wouldn't look at me. The junior devs stared at their shoes. I was alone. The guards moved forward, one of them taking my arm. I pulled away, straightening my jacket. Don't touch me, I said. I looked at Julian one last time. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was already leaning over Carter's shoulder, pointing at the screen. pretending to solve a problem he had created. He had what he wanted. He had a scapegoat. He had a story for the investors. Rogue employee. Sabotage. We are the victims. I walked out of the war room, the guards trailing me like I was a convict. The walk to my desk to get my bag felt like a funeral procession. I didn't pack my personal items. I didn't take the photo of Jasper. I just grabbed my purse and my keys. I couldn't bear to look at the remnants of the life I had built here. It was all ash now. The elevator ride down was silent. The guard swiped his card to let me out, effectively locking me out of the building forever. I stood on the sidewalk in the pre-dawn gray. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and cold. I was shaking not from the cold but from the adrenaline crash. I had played the game and I had lost. I had tried to use their own rules against them, but I had underestimated how little the rules mattered to people like Julian. He didn't care about truth. He cared about narrative, and he controlled the narrative. I walked to my car, my legs feeling like lead. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel. I checked my bank account on my phone. $400. That was it. That was all that was left after the last payment to Dr. Eris. The next treatment was due on Thursday. It cost $2,000. I didn't have a job. I didn't have a reputation. I was about to be sued by a man with unlimited resources. I started the car, the engine sputtering to life. I felt a sob rising in my chest, a hot, jagged thing that threatened to tear me apart. I clamped my hand over my mouth, forcing it down. I couldn't brake. Not yet. I had to get home to Jasper. He was the only thing that was real. He was the only thing that wasn't corrupted. As I pulled out of the garage, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a notification from the cloud server I used for my personal projects. A synchronization alert. I frowned. I hadn't synced anything in weeks. I tapped the screen at a red light. The notification was from the Legacy Archive, a folder I had set up 5 years ago, back when Julian and I were just starting. It was a mirror of the original Sentinel source code, the pure, unadulterated version before the investors, before Carter, before the bloat. I stared at the file path. It wasn't just a backup. It was the origin. And because I had been the one to set up the repository architecture all those years ago, the system still recognized my personal credentials as the root creator for that specific, ancient directory. Julian had revoked my corporate access. He had locked me out of the current system. But he had forgotten that Sentinel wasn't just one program. It was a descendant of this first, forgotten seed. A strange, cold clarity washed over me. Julian thought he had cut all the strings. He thought he had severed the limb. But he didn't understand the anatomy of his own creature. He was trying to fix a skyscraper by painting the windows, unaware that the foundation was connected to a detonator he didn't even know existed. I wasn't going to fix his broken code. I wasn't going to save his company, but I wasn't going to let him destroy me without a fight. I drove home, the city waking up around me. The despair was still there, heavy and suffocating, but it was joined by something else. A realization. Julian had accused me of sabotage. He had accused me of negligence. He had built a lie to ruin me. But in his rush to assign blame, he had made a critical error. He had left the root access to the original kernel active, buried under 5 years of updates, accessible only to the biometric key of the founder. And officially, on the original incorporation papers he had never bothered to update, there were 2 founders. I pulled into my driveway. The lights were off in the house. Jasper would be waiting. I needed to feed him. I needed to calculate how much pain medication we had left. And then I needed to open my laptop. Not the company machine they had confiscated, but my old personal rig. The one with the sticker of a golden retriever on the lid. The one that held the keys to the kingdom Julian thought he ruled alone. He wanted a war. He wanted to talk about ownership. Fine. We would talk. But this time, I wasn't going to speak his language. I was going to speak mine. The notification on my laptop screen was a simple green rectangle, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding on the news ticker in the browser window behind it. Access granted. User. Founder 2. I sat at my kitchen table, the chipped laminate cool under my elbows, and stared at the directory structure of the Sentinel Legacy Archive. Julian had scrubbed my name from the website. He had revoked my badge. He had locked me out of the active servers. But he had never understood that the system wasn't just the shiny interface he sold to clients. It was built on a kernel of logic I had written 5 years ago. A kernel that contained an immutable audit log designed to survive a nuclear war. Or, in this case, a corporate cover-up. I navigated through the folders, my fingers trembling slightly. I wasn't hacking. I was accessing my own intellectual property, verified by the biometric scanner on my personal machine. I pulled up the command authorization history for the last 48 hours. It was all there. Not just the keystrokes, but the authorization tokens. The log showed the exact moment the checksums were disabled. It showed the user ID responsible for the override command. It wasn't mine. It was a root override authorized by the CEO's personal encryption key. Julian hadn't just sent an email. He had physically entered his passcode on Carter's terminal to bypass the safety lock. The timestamp matched the email I had saved. Priority speed. I downloaded the log file. It was a small file, only a few kilobytes, but it weighed more than the building I had just been kicked out of. This was my shield. With this, his lawsuit for sabotage would dissolve before it even reached a courtroom. I saved it to 3 different cloud drives and a USB stick. Then I closed the laptop. Jasper nudged my leg under the table. I reached down to scratch his ears, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. We were safe. The realization washed over me like a cold shower. I didn't have a job, but I wasn't a criminal. And Julian Thorne was about to learn that gravity applies to everyone, even him. By noon, the collapse of Thorne Analytics had moved from industry gossip to national news. I watched the live stream on my phone while I made tea. The Apex Logistics stock had dropped 12% in 4 hours. Trucks were sitting idle in distribution centers from Shanghai to Los Angeles because the routing software was sending them to the middle of the ocean. Reporters were standing outside the Thorne Tower, filming employees walking out with boxes. They looked shell-shocked. I recognized Carter in the background of one shot, arguing with a cameraman, looking less like a visionary strategist and more like a child who had broken a vase. My phone rang at 1:15 p.m. The caller ID displayed Thorne Analytics, executive line. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. It rang again immediately. I let it ring. On the 3rd attempt, I picked up. I didn't say anything. I just listened to the heavy, panicked breathing on the other end. It was a sound I had never heard from Julian before. He was hyperventilating. "Renee," he said, his voice cracking. "Renee, are you there?" I took a sip of my tea. "I'm here, Julian. Though I'm surprised you have time to call. Shouldn't you be speaking to legal about my sabotage lawsuit?" There was a pause, a wet, desperate sound. "Forget the lawsuit," he said. "The lawyers we dropped it. It's gone. Renee, the corruption has hit the financial ledger. The system is erasing transaction histories. We're losing millions of dollars a minute." "That sounds like a severe operational failure," I said calmly. "Have you tried rebooting the instance?" It was the exact advice Carter had given me on Friday. The silence on the line was thick with humiliation. "Don't do this," Julian whispered. "Please. Carter can't fix it. He doesn't even know where the kernel interface is. The backups are gone. You're the only one who knows the architecture. You're the only one who can rebuild the index before the data is lost forever." "I see," I said. "You want me to work on the Sentinel engine?" "Yes," he shouted, the facade crumbling completely. "I'll pay you whatever you want. Double your salary. Triple. I'll give you equity. Just come back. Send me the code patch. Remote in. Anything. Just stop the bleeding." I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had cleared, leaving the sky a bruised purple. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Julian." "Why?" he demanded. "It's just money, Renee. I know you need it. I know about the vet bills. I'll pay for the dog's surgery right now. Wire transfer. Just say yes." "It's not about the money," I said. "It's about the contract." "Screw the contract," he screamed. "I can't," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I signed a document on Thursday. A document you insisted on. Specifically the non-compete clause. It states that I am prohibited from working on, consulting for, or developing predictive modeling software for any entity for a period of 5 years. If I were to touch the Sentinel code right now, I would be in violation of my employment agreement. And since you threatened to sue me into oblivion for the slightest infraction, I'm going to follow your rules to the letter. I'll waive it. Julian was sobbing now. I'll rip it up. I'm the CEO. I can cancel the contract. I'd need that in writing, I said. Reviewed and notarized by independent counsel. Given the current state of your legal department, that should take about 3 days. We don't have 3 days. We don't have 3 hours. That is unfortunate, I said. But I really can't risk my professional reputation by violating a binding legal agreement. I'm sure you understand. You were very clear about the importance of compliance. I heard a crash on the other end, the sound of something expensive shattering against a wall. You're enjoying this, he hissed. You're watching everything I built burn to the ground, and you're enjoying it. I didn't build the fire, Julian, I said. I just refused to be the extinguisher you threw away. I hung up the phone. Then I blocked the number. I looked at the laptop screen one last time. I opened a new email window. In the recipient line, I typed the address for the Chief Technology Officer of Apex Logistics. I attached the audit log file. I wrote a short message regarding the service outage. Please find attached the immutable authorization logs from the Sentinel kernel. These records confirm that the removal of safety protocols was ordered by the CEO account against technical advisement. I believe this will be relevant to your liability investigation. I hit send. It wasn't revenge. It was a correction. The truth was a dataset, and I had just published it. 2 weeks later, the liquidation sale was announced. Thorn Analytics was being broken up for parts. The intellectual property, what was left of it, was purchased for pennies on the dollar by a competitor who mostly wanted the client list. Julian was facing a shareholder lawsuit and an SEC investigation for misleading investors about the company's technical stability. The photos in the paper showed him leaving the courthouse, looking old and small, shielding his face with a briefcase. Carter had scrubbed his LinkedIn profile, but the internet never forgets. I sat on the porch steps, watching Jasper chase a tennis ball in the small yard. He was slow, and his gait was a little uneven, but he was happy. The settlement check from my wrongful termination claim, paid out by the insurance company before the bankruptcy froze Julian's assets, had cleared yesterday. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough to pay off Dr. Eris completely. It was enough to cover rent for 6 months while I figured out what was next. I wasn't the architect anymore. I wasn't a partner. I was just a coder with a resume that had a crater in it. But my phone had started ringing again. Not Julian. Recruiters. People who had heard the whispers about who had really built the engine, and who had refused to break it until forced. They didn't want the visionary. They wanted the mechanic who knew where the brakes were. I called Jasper over. He trotted up, dropping the slobbery ball in my lap. I rested my hand on his head. We're okay, I told him. And for the first time in 5 years I believed it. The empire had fallen, the king was in exile, and the ghost in the machine was finally free to walk away.